Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black History Month edition of Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Yasmin Mensah, the Alumni Engagement Officer at York University. Thank you for joining us for today's session titled Buried Histories, Racial Geographies of Memory from New York to Toronto. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land I am on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, I would like to conduct a quick poll before the session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now. I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thank you. Okay, this helps our speakers learn more about our audience. So if you need help with the Zoom webinar as well, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. So the same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer questions during the Q&A period. You may enter questions at any time during the presentation as well. So please note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Okay, so now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Safia Rochelle. Safia Rochelle is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Science Criminology program at the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Her research and teaching centers on contemporary political and legal theory, critical visual and race studies, and state violence and criminalization. Her current project explores the spatial, visual, and racial boundaries of mourning and memorialization within urban landscapes. So I would like to welcome Safia. The floor is yours now. You can go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Yasmin. I just want to start actually by thanking Scholars Hub and everyone involved in this for extending me the opportunity to give this talk today during Black History Month, and a big thank you to everyone in attendance as well. So I'll share my screen, hopefully successfully. Okay, hopefully that works and everyone can see. So, I wanted to start today's talk with a claim that I think is quite simple, and that is that cities don't just have or contain or display history. So the idea that cities also produce memory through what they preserve, what they erase, and also how they organize remembrance in space. So my guiding concept today is something that I call racial geographies of memory. So this is the way that public remembrance and public forgetting are organized spatially. So through planning, through memorials and monuments, through museums, but also in spatial patterns that reproduce hierarchies of belonging and value. And these patterns also determine whose histories become heritage, whose deaths and erasure become publicly mournable, and whose losses remain as unmarked or unmemorialized or even actively erased. So today I'm going to walk us through several interconnected sites. So the first is the African American Burial Ground Monument in New York's Lower Manhattan neighborhood, which I will call the ABGM just for the sake of brevity. And then I'm going to read that alongside the nearby 9/11 Memorial and Museum. And then I'm going to bring it to Canada and specifically to Toronto's historic Ward neighborhood. So throughout, I want to invite everyone to think about these sites and these geographies as both layered and sedimented, but also as relational. So the city is not a single story or history, nor is it just like a successive procession of stories and histories. Rather, its current shape is always built upon layers of life, of death, and also memory. So this layered approach asks us to consider what has been built over, what remains underneath a city, and then this relational approach accounts for the fact that a site's meaning is never self-contained. So it's always produced through proximity, what surrounds the site, what other memorials or memories compete within the same landscape. So with that, we can go to Lower Manhattan. The first thing to appreciate about this area, and it's something that makes it such an analytically rich space, is that it is densely layered, right? So it's this densely layered urban space that is shaped by histories of indigenous dispossession, colonial settlement, enslavement, and immigration or migration. It is a very distinct urban landscape, and it's also a place where the racial politics of memory and death and commemoration are materially embedded into the built environment. So within a radius of just 2.5 kilometers, it contains also these major memorial, civic, and burial sites that bring these multiple histories into close physical proximity. One of these memorial sites is the African Burial Ground and African Burial Ground Monument. So how did this site come about? For roughly a century, so from the mid 1600s to the late 1700s, there was a plot of land that was north of the city limits that served as the burial site for thousands of enslaved and free Africans and African descendants in Lower Manhattan. This was the only cemetery where this community was allowed to bury their dead, as laws and city ordinances prohibited their internment in public cemeteries. So this was a place that was long forgotten by the city and its inhabitants. It itself was buried under dense urban development and landfill, and it only came to light in 1991, kind of accidentally, through urban development. So it was during the construction of a federal office building when workers came across these human remains about 30 feet below street level. Eventually, about an acre was excavated, revealing 419 remains, although historians estimate that more than 15,000 people were buried there. So the excavation of these remains is never, only a technical or forensic matter. It's also ethical and social, especially when the dead belong to communities that have been historically denied dignity or memory. So the excavation quickly became an ethical and political struggle. Descendant communities mobilized, construction was halted, and the site was eventually designated a national monument in 2006 by presidential proclamation. The remains were also studied at Howard University before they were brought back to the site and reinterred near the original grounds. So the discovery of these burial grounds also fundamentally shifted thinking about early African American history in New York and also in the broader nation. So it shattered this persistent myth that slavery was primarily a Southern phenomenon. And it revealed that New York and its development as a Northern commercial hub was in fact deeply structured by enslaved labor. And it was also evidence of the scale of Black presence in early New York, not only as slave labor, but as a vibrant community presence. At the same time, I think, we can be a bit cautious about the language of discovery. It kind of suggests an intent on the part of the city, but no one was looking for these remains. The city was not trying to confront its past. It was simply a matter of, construction requires digging. And it's ironic that it was only during excavation for the purposes of a federal project that Black history emerged, right? Construction had to quite literally cut through the city's layers and to make this erasure materially impossible to sustain. Additionally, the burial ground was not simply found, it was fought for. It was fought for through mobilization, through demands that the dead be treated with respect and as ancestors, and through this insistence that Black history was not marginal, but actually foundational. So at this point, you might think it's a success story. A buried history becomes a national monument. The dead become ancestors honored in public, and in some ways, it is very much so. But this layered analysis that I'm interested in also requires that we ask or consider, where is this monument located and what surrounds it? So for one, it's located in the heart of Lower Manhattan's financial district, but it's also very, very close to another major site of memory. So it is a mere, depending on how fast you walk, 10 to 15-minute walk away from the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. So this shows that Lower Manhattan contains these multiple spaces of memory and mourning that coexist in the urban geography, but they don't exist on equal terms. So when we read these sites relationally, for one, we can see this uneven architecture of mourning. The 9/11 Memorial sits on 8 acres. Its design was selected through this global international competition, and it centers these two massive reflecting pools placed in the footprints of the former towers. The memorial occupies an expansive and central city space, and it also enjoys full institutional backing. We can compare this to the ABGM, which acquires or occupies a much smaller footprint within this dense financial district. It was not the product of a global design competition, but again, emerged through struggle, through excavation, through protest, and through negotiation. Its memorial architecture is symbolically powerful, but also spatially modest. So it has a raised earthen mound, a libation court, a spiral ramp descending toward the level of the original burials, but it also sits, once again, embedded among federal buildings rather than dominating the skyline. And this contrast matters, right? So one memorial commands this vast open space, it anchors tourism in the city, and it also structures a national narrative at the monumental scale. And the other is comparatively contained. It is intimate rather than expansive, and its presence is negotiated. And this is not simply a matter of aesthetic difference. It also reflects how national legitimacy and public grief are materially distributed across urban space. It's worth noting as well that these two sites tell very different stories about which memories and which deaths are granted national legitimacy and mourning. So the 9/11 Memorial is very much a state-sanctioned story of grief. It is organized around narratives of innocence, of sacrifice, of patriotism, and a shared national trauma. It also occurs within a framing where the United States is seen as an innocent victim attacked from external sources. The African burial ground tells a very different story. It organizes community grief around a longer history that is not the result of external violence. It is built into the very foundations of the nation, and it shows how slavery and racial capitalism were built into the very ground of the city itself. So Now I want us to move to Canada. And I want us to move to Canada not just to, add a Canadian angle to this study, but because I think these sites are really part of a shared North American landscape of racial ordering. It's also important to think of these sites together because the Canadian national story often positions itself as less implicated in slavery, and it positions Black history primarily as a story of refuge. So this concept of racial geographies of memory and thinking of these sites once again as layered and relational helps us to see this Canadian history and suppressed racial memories more clearly. And we can use it to ask, where is Black history placed in a city's landscape and what has been built over it? So Toronto's ward was an area located downtown, bounded by College, Queen, University, and Yonge Streets. Today, much of this footprint includes Nathan Phillips Square, Toronto City Hall, and hospital and civic complexes. The ward was a crucial arrival point for newcomers from the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries, but the earliest concentrated community in the ward was composed of African Americans escaping slavery. By the mid-19th century, over half of Toronto's Black population lived in this area. It was also a site of Black civic life, institution building, and everyday survival. Black residents built churches, organized mutual aid societies, participated in civic life, and it was also a site of significant abolitionist organizing. The history of the ward also complicates Canada's national story. It unsettles the narrative that Black history in Toronto is marginal or recent. It is not an afterthought. It was actually part of the city's early development. And it also grounds Black urban presence as foundational to the terrain and to Canada as a whole. It also confirms that Black refugees from slavery did arrive and settle in Canada, but not into this kind of racial utopia. So rather than sending or presenting Canada as the moral and geographic endpoint of freedom, the history of the wards suggests that these residents encountered racial exclusion, economic precarity, and spatial containment. The later disappearance of the ward also reveals that refuge did not equal permanence or belonging. Canada may have offered refuge from slavery, but it did not guarantee protection from racialized displacement and erasure. So the ward also disrupts Canada's self-image as historically benign or racially innocent, and it reveals segregation, containment, and displacement at the heart of the city. So as I noted also, the ward was a space that was located in the urban core, so not at its margins. This means also that Black life was situated in intimate relations to the city's evolving infrastructures of governance, of health, and a civic identity. And this is precisely one of the reasons why it became a target of redevelopment pressure because of its centrality. So by the late 19th centuries, public health reports and municipal photography were used to recast the ward as overcrowded, unsanitary, and pathological, justifying its clearance as reform and progress. And over time, Black presence was layered over by civic and government infrastructure. So unlike the ABGM, where, excavation kind of physically interrupted development and forced rediscovery and memory, the ward disappeared gradually through expropriation, through demolition, through expansion, and through redevelopment. And this disappearance was narrated as modernization and a matter of public good. In this process, there was no crisis of memory around the disappearance of the ward as it was absorbed through this incremental bureaucratic disappearance. And in keeping, memory of the space remains fragmented. It exists in policy documents, inspection photos, scattered stories, rather than in an official protected memorial site. Of course, this doesn't mean that it is entirely forgotten. So the Ward Museum, for example, plays a very important role in preserving this history, but the preservation operates differently. It is community driven and archival rather than monumental. and the built environment itself no longer carries that memory on its own. And in fact, the Ward Museum emphasizes that stories and images from residents and descendants are so central to understanding what happened precisely because the built environment no longer carries that memory on its own. So how can we bring these sites and these stories and these memories together? So taken together, these cases and these sites reveal two modalities of racial govern or racial geographies of memory within a shared North American racial order. In both cities, national memory or its absence sits atop earlier racialized presence and are layered over racial dispossession. And when we read these sites relationally, we can see how racial hierarchies become sedimented into the built environment. Some losses are monumentalized at the center of national identities, and others must struggle to become visible at all. And we can see how memory is produced or erased through these factors of proximity, through spatial governance, and through institutional power. And this brings us back to the guiding claim of the talk, really, and that is, once again, that cities do not simply contain history, they also produce memory. And they do so through preservation and erasure, and through these spatial arrangements that determine whose histories and lives remain as something that we can encounter in public and which are made to disappear entirely. So thank you all for being here today, for engaging with these ideas. I'm very grateful for your time and attention, and I look forward to any questions that you may have and to continuing this conversation with everyone here.
Thank you so much for this informative talk. I personally have learned a lot. It's definitely interesting to see the comparison between both cities and also what's seen as a priority, what isn't. As do you know, like monuments are definitely needed for like learning and also for people to feel comfort. So thank you so much for this. This is great. Okay, so
Welcome.
we can go ahead. It's now time for questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to drop in your questions. Okay. Okay, I think we have one question. Imani, is the Underground Railroad pathways preserved or mostly erased?
Sorry, is that in Canada or the United States or?
I think this is mainly in the United States, but yeah, both. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there are some pathways that are preserved, absolutely. It depends on which locations you're looking at. So if we look at Canada, for example, we do have monuments and memorials and sort of placards or placements that would indicate the spaces where the pathways led into freedom, for example. And similarly, in the United States as well, and probably to a larger extent as well. So if the actual pathways themselves are not preserved, we have markers and memorial placards that would preserve the those pathways in national kind of memory, we can say.
Thank you. Hopefully it answers your question, Imani. So we have another question from Davina. It says, how do you see the 15 years that it took to build the Eglinton Avenue LRT as contributing to the physical erasure of the Black community here in Canada?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. I feel like I should also place a caveat here that I'm relatively new to Toronto, so I'm learning this history as well, right? So I've only been here for about 4 or 5 years. I'm originally from Ottawa. But this has been something that I've been following as a resident, but also with attention to the fact that it's taking place within a historically Black community in Toronto, right? And it is largely impacting Black businesses, Black residents, and I've seen the mobilization and community efforts around that as well as these, city promises that have not been met, etc. So, I mean, I would say there is, we can think about the extent of time that has taken for this redevelopment to happen as part of just like the city infrastructure and what happens pretty regularly throughout the city. But we can also think about it in relation, once again, to this specific space and location in the city and the communities that are located there, where these efforts to maintain the space among this redevelopment or amidst this redevelopment is not just about, resistance to development. It is also about preserving memory and preserving presence and preserving life really in the neighborhood. So yeah, it's part of, I would say, this racial geography of memory that I'm interested in looking at.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have another question. It says, from Steffi. Thank you for this insightful talk. Based on your research, what do you think, or who do you think, sorry, tends to determine which lives or deaths are memorialized in urban spaces? And what are mechanisms, power structures can be tweaked by groups that were historically marginalized to change the practice of historical erasure?
Hmm. That's again a very good question, right? So I think that especially when you look at the kinds of the intersection between these memories and these memorials and national narratives and national storytelling, right? So, to what extent does memory align with national narratives, and to what extent does it disrupt or disturb those? And those memories, whether they come in the form of, excavated graves or communities trying to stay alive amidst redevelopment, are always measured against, or are often measured against, national storytelling and myths that traffic in not only erasure, but also in this kind of like hierarchy of memories, right? Where there is like a distinct, we can call it a racial ordering, or we can just simply call it a hierarchy of the kinds of stories that matter in space, that matter in monuments and museums, and that also align with a certain narrative of the nation, right? And that's why I think the 9/11 memorial is so interesting to look at in relation to the ABGM. They're so close to each other. You can walk there really, really quickly, right? And when you're there, the sheer scale of the 9/11 museum in comparison to this tiny, tiny little museum that's kind of buried itself in the heart of the city really brings this to light. In terms of what can be done to, disrupt this kind of hierarchy, I think that community research is really important. Community archival work, that's something that, the Ward Museum recognizes as well. So community research and activism can really help to complicate and disrupt these stories, these myths, these national narratives, and to preserve history in a way that, still allows for memories to exist within public space, even if the state does not, create a massive monument around it. So the role of communities cannot be underestimated here, I think.
Thank you. Hey, so another question from Julie. Ramadan Mubarak to you.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on taking down memorials, renaming streets that commemorate historical figures such as Dundas?
Yeah, this is a good one. Yeah, thank you for the Ramadan Mubarak. If there's any gaps or repetition in my answers, that's because, it is the first day of fasting, so it's an adjustment period. Yeah, this is an interesting kind of topic. Um, and it's something that I have mixed ideas or about. I think absolutely, right? Especially when we appreciate the fact that memorials are not neutral. they are decidedly not neutral, right? They make these claims about legitimacy in the present. They authorize particular narratives. They elevate certain lives as publicly grievable. All of that removal in that sense makes sense as a form, but not as a form of erasure, right? Or destruction, which is often how it gets framed, especially in the media, but rather as a form of recontextualization or a retelling of the story, a counter kind of memorialization, which I think is a good way or the best way that I can really think about it, right? So it's about building new memories and new monuments, or bringing old buried ones to life in a way that disrupts these older narratives. And sometimes that does involve the actual removal of a monument or a statue. But I think that should be accompanied also by this counter memorialization, right? It's not just removal, it is a retelling of the story. If that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. And next question is from Janice. How would you organize a motion for Black people to access compensation for slavery? For example, as the Indigenous people have had in Canada for colonialism.
Right. So can you just repeat the first part about emotion? Yeah.
Yes, so it says, how would you organize a motion for Black people to access compensation for slavery? That's the first
Hmm.
question.
Okay, so actually, reparations is something that I'm very interested in. I think that, again, I have mixed sort of feelings about it, not because I don't think reparations are necessary and needed, but also I think because it almost always involves an appeal to institutional authority, right? And when we get into the realm of racial reparations that are linked to racial violence and also racial identity, then it becomes this weird thing of like trying to prove to the state in a way that they recognize that you belong to a racial group, which is kind of reasserting a lot of the problems that we're trying to avoid. At the same time, though, I think that, and there are shared stories here between Indigenous communities and Black communities in this regard as well. When it comes to the role of emotion and affect, I think that is also oftentimes missing from the reparations conversation. It's a very much rooted in like financial compensation, land return, institutional reform. All of those are absolutely necessary, right? And are integral to the conversation. But I think operating at that emotional kind of register that also brings in these aspects of recognition, of public acknowledgement, of, validating that harm was done and harm continues, and speaking to that injustice is also like to me more important than the financial compensation actually. So I would, ideally, if anybody would ever ask me, I would encourage that as really the placing emotion and affect at the center of reparations claims, and alongside these more structural claims to land and to money as well. They're not inseparable.
It's very true.
Mm.
Then the next question is from Philistina. It says, in Canada, these burial grounds reflected the Harriet Tubman era. What steps have been taken to prevent the erasures of these ancestral sacred spaces?
In Canada.
Yeah, I was like, Harriet Tubman, yes. In
Or
Canada, her question was in Canada, these burial grounds reflected the Harriet Tubman era. What steps have been taken to prevent the erasures of these ancestral sacred spaces? Like, Christina, I'm sure I even understand the question, actually. Hopefully, if there's like more clarification on that.
yeah, some
Great.
some clarification would be great
Yes.
there. Maybe she
Uh,
means in the United
In the
States.
United
Yeah.
States, yeah, I was like,
Mhm.
probably, but okay, so we can go to Angeli's question. It says, what comparisons or differences do you see between the story of Toronto Ward and Africville in Nova Scotia.
Yes, 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 yes. And yeah, as I had been thinking about this research, right? This has been at the center of my mind, right? Because obviously, this is a major site of erasure, precisely what I am talking about, right? But we should also be aware of the fact that it has its, or Africville had its own distinct kind of modality of erasure, right? So there are obvious resemblances between Africville and the ward. Both were these centrally located Black communities. Both were recoded as blighted, as unfit. They were cleared in the name of modernization. Both were kind of absorbed into the civic infrastructure. Um, it is interesting, though, to note that Africville, there is far more of a living memory in relation to that location, where especially descendants play such a, direct role in keeping that memory alive and in keeping a certain level of public reckoning alive as well. Uh, the ward operates a little differently, especially in terms of the role of descendant communities, right? And I'm still trying to figure out precisely where that difference comes, whether it is because of the way that the ward was also home to many other new immigrant groups to Canada, for example. It was its own very densely urban space, whether it's the ward's location, its proximity at the center of the city, and how that became especially erasable because of, this language of development, etc. So it's actually really interesting to think about these two locations in relation to each other, where there are these clear parallels, but then we see these real differences in terms of public memory, and trying to think about why that would be. It's still something I'm trying to figure out. To not answer your question. Yeah, but it's a great question and something that I'm trying to think through for sure.
Let's see. The next question is from Janice as well. It says to create a support for Black people who have suffered from slavery, and if not compensation for slavery, where would you begin to create supports to uplift and strengthen the community of persons, of people who have suffered from slavery? I think that was it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think what is so important here is really precisely what we've been talking about, right? This excavation of memory, whether we think about it in the material and physical sense, actual excavation, or through a reliance on communities and descendant communities to bring these histories to light, and not in a way that burdens these communities, right? But trust them as the carriers of these stories, and of these counter memories, really, right? And I think it's such an urgent um, plea, really, because there is this sense that slavery is so far removed from history, right? And the even the descendants or impacts of slavery are so far removed. So often it's not even a question of, whether we still have this emotional, it still has an emotional impact on communities, but it's also like a practical kind of matter as more and more, stories are lost essentially. But I always remember, in my own family, my grandfather's grandmother was born into slavery, right? When she was born, slavery was still legal in the United States. That's how close the memory is, right? It's still right there. So I think any effort needs to start with an appreciation of the extent to which this is not past and this is not history and this is still lived experience and a part of people's familial stories and community stories. It has to be rooted in that. And that takes also, conversation. It takes making connections also between communities in North America, for example. Yeah, in my mind, it has to start there and flow from that that level of appreciation of the presence still of this history.
Thank you. Hey, I think that's it for our questions. Oh, actually, no. It's not. Okay. One question. So from Thompson, I think it's very interesting that it is always the removal of people for development and their stories are never told. Hence, they did not contribute to the economic, cultural fabric of Canada or the United States. I think
Mm.
it's about sharing the truth of what really occurred and building a better future. Thank you. Okay, so that's more of a statement. Thank you.
But I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. And okay, I think that is the end of our Q&A. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sophia, for being with us today. It was very insightful. So you're welcome to turn off your video now.
Thank you for having me. It was a
You're
pleasure.
Hey, so a recording of the video will be posted on our YouTube channel. So please see the link in the chat where you can revisit this and many more, or many of our discussions of Scholars Hub at home as well. So we have one more poll for the audience. So once the question would be, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? It should pop up on your screen right now. Okay. Thank you all so much for answering. So we will be back on Wednesday, March 4th, with a session titled America at the Edge of History, Expansion, Power, and the Fragile World Order with Boyd Cothran, professor from the Department of History and the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. So please check our website for more information on this and other exciting events that we have. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all so much.